When Katie Wilson married Thad Roberts, she thought the stars had aligned.
We've had a lot in common. We were both members of the Mormon church. Both of us growing up were nerds. We were very much in love.
But for Katie's ambitious husband,
she was very excited that he was going to become an astronaut.
That dream would come crashing down to Earth.
I was in shock. I didn't know what to think.
Well, I think this was probably the most significant theft that NASA had ever experienced.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. They say beauty's in the eye of the beholder. It's an adage Katie Wilson was all too familiar with.
I was a pretty big nerd back in high school, and I didn't really go on a lot of dates. I was overweight, not that cute.
So in the fall of 1994, the Salt Lake City High School senior was pleasantly surprised when a handsome classmate began paying attention to her. His name was Thad Roberts.
He was pretty physically fit. He was intense, energetic.
Katie agreed to go out with Thad, and on their first date, she quickly realized the two had a lot in common.
We were both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which a lot of people refer to as the Mormon religion. He was the older child in his family, and I was the younger child, and so neither of us really got a lot of attention in our families. Both of us growing up were nerds.
The two teens bonded quickly, and before long, Katie and Thad were over the moon for each other.
Katie was head over heels for Thad. He's really good at, you're beautiful, I love you, you're wonderful. She fell madly in love with him.
After just 4 months of dating, Katie and Thad knew they were destined for the altar. But before they could say their I do's, there was just one holdup. In the summer of 1996, soon after starting college, Thad left for a 2-year missionary trip.
It was so hard. We both cried so much before he went on his mission. Because even though you know you're going to wait for each other, you don't get to spend time together. All you can really do is write letters to each other.
After Thad's departure, Katie tore open the letter he left behind, fully expecting a heartfelt goodbye. But instead, she got a crushing confession.
So when I opened up the letter, inside there it had said that there was a girl in his English class in college that he had actually tried to ask her on a date, and it broke my heart.
Katie was devastated, and she wondered why Thad had chosen to confess in a letter.
He had called me on the phone when he landed from the airport, and I was just crying, and he just didn't understand why I was hurt. He told me that he didn't want to have any secrets in our relationship. He wanted to just get everything out in the open. I felt better after I got off the phone. I felt relieved that, at least he wanted to be honest with me.
As soon as Thad returned home, he did what Katie had hoped he would do. He asked her to be his wife. That August, the happy couple tied the knot in a church ceremony with God, family, and friends as their witnesses.
I felt like a princess, and I was so excited because I was with my prince, and we were going to go off and start our lives together. I was really happy.
The newlyweds were glowing, but just 6 years later, their starry romance would go down in flames. In July of 2002, Thad was doing an internship in Houston, Texas, while Katie kept the home fires burning in Utah. The distance between them had been taking its toll on the couple.
It was really hard when he'd go do internships. Just being apart for so long, I was really concerned about our relationship.
On July 22, 2002, Katie answered a phone call from Thad, fully expecting to talk about their marriage. But instead, Thad had an explosive announcement.
He told me that he was calling me from prison. I was just in shock. Why is he in prison?
In the summer of 1996, Katie Wilson was certain she and her husband Thad Roberts had the right stuff.
Our first few years of marriage, we had a lot of fun. We did everything together. I worked full-time and he went to school.
By now, Thad had decided to focus on science and pursue a triple major in geophysics, physics, and geology.
I'd go on his geology field trips with him, and I started really getting interested in rocks, and so we started our own collection.
The young couple's new rock collection was growing as steadily as their relationship. And frequently, Thad would add new, notable items to their shelves.
Thad was a volunteer up at the museum, and he would bring home specimens from the museum and say that the professors, that they liked him so much that they would just give him specimens that we could add to our collection.
Katie was proud of her brilliant husband, but at times she couldn't help but feel inadequate in Thad's shadow.
Katie looked to Thad for approval a lot of the time, whether it was her looks, whether it was her hanging out with other people.
I think Thad knew that I was really insecure about myself. He always did tell me, I wish you could lose weight. I want you to dress differently. It hurt, and it made me want to try to be a different person. But at the same time, I was in love with him.
Katie was a very loyal wife. Katie did anything that Thad told her.
In May of 2000, Thad's future seemed to shine even brighter when he landed a NASA internship for aspiring astronauts.
So the internship was in Houston, Texas. He would go do it one semester every year, and they had to do 4 of them. I was excited for Thad because he was reaching his goals. He wanted to be one of the first astronauts to go to Mars, and I knew he was smart enough to do it.
That September, Thad set off for Texas, while Katie stayed behind in Utah. She was thrilled for her husband, but she hated being separated from him.
I was a wreck. I cried all of the time.
Still, Katie was pleased when Thad's first semester went smoothly. But when he returned from his second, Thad had some devastating news.
So we went for a little walk. He looked at me and he says, well, I met another woman, and I'm in love with her.
The other woman was an intern at NASA.
That broke my heart. I was shattered inside. And so he started to just say, well, there is still a chance of us being together, but there are some things that you need to change if you want to get me back. And he started telling me that I needed to lose weight and that I needed to find my own hobbies. I needed to go to school. So, not only is he telling me that, hey, I cheated on you, I'm in love with somebody else, here's a whole list of things that you need to change if you ever want to be with me again.
He just was so controlling that I felt this was another way for Thad to control Katie, to say, see, look, I can leave you fast.
Thad moved out of their apartment and left Katie no choice but to agree to a separation.
We were free to date other people, and he went and lived up at the physics department up at school.
With her self-esteem completely shot and her marriage on the rocks, Katie decided it was time to make some changes.
After we were separated, I started to go ahead and take classes up at the college, and I started exercising. I found a gym to go to, and I started making some friends, and I started finding myself.
Before long, Thad realized he'd made a terrible mistake.
We had been separated for about a month, maybe 2, and I walked in the house, and Thad was in my house. I was wondering why and what was going on, and then I walked into the bedroom, and I saw the flowers all over, and I saw the candles lit. He said he missed me and loved me, that he didn't need to be with the other girl. Of course I was going to take him back. He's my husband. I love him, and I didn't want to be with anybody else. I did tell him, I said, you hurt me really, really bad. I said, I am still in a lot of pain, but just to know that if you cheat on me again, then we will get divorced.
Katie was glad to have her marriage back on track. She could never have known that Thad's affair was the most innocuous of his secrets.
And he said the FBI caught me, and I'm in jail now.
They basically ruined their lives forever.
By the spring of 2002, Katie Wilson was sure her marriage to Thad Roberts was on the mend. And when she sent him off for his 3rd tour at NASA, Katie was in good spirits.
The 3rd time he went to Houston, things were really good. We were happy. He seemed excited for me to go down and visit him.
That April, Katie boarded a plane to Houston. Once there, Thad showed her around the NASA facilities.
Not very many people get to go to NASA and go in the shuttle simulator and train where the astronauts train. It was really cool.
Thad also introduced Katie to his mentor, Dr. Everett Gibson, a renowned NASA scientist who invited the couple to his lab. There, he showed them something that clearly made an impression on Thad.
We went into a lab, and there were moon rocks in there, and there were little slices that you could put under the microscope. When Thad was looking at the moon rocks, he was so excited it was like a kid in a candy store.
Touching a piece of the moon seemed to have an effect on Thad's ever-active imagination.
Thad just looked at me and he says, "Wouldn't it be cool if we could steal one of these and sell it? We could make a lot of money." I'm like, yeah.
Following their visit, Katie and Thad's relationship seemed stronger than ever. So later that month, when Thad returned home from his third tour and started acting withdrawn and secretive again, Katie was beyond frustrated.
He would come home pretty late at times without telling me where he was. And I had dinner ready on the table, and I was upset because I was just sitting there waiting, and he didn't come home.
Dad would always give an excuse about staying out late. I was stargazing at the university. I was putting together a club. I was studying.
Thad also told Katie he'd been spending a lot of time with a new university friend, a guy named Gordon McWhorter.
Thad did tell me that Gordon had had kind of a shaky past. He had been arrested previously, and he was just trying to help him out a little bit. They would study together and hang out quite a bit together, but he never really gave me a lot of details.
Katie wanted to believe her husband, but in the summer of 2002, when she dropped him off for his fourth and final tour at NASA, she had a sinking feeling that Thad wasn't to be trusted.
On our drive to NASA, I told him, I said, I just feel like you're going to cheat on me again. He did tell me that he did love me, but I still felt a little gut feeling inside of me just telling me that something was going to happen.
And 3 weeks later, Katie realized she was right.
So over 4th of July weekend, I was planning a trip to go out and visit him in Houston, and I kept trying to call him to get a hold of him before I came down.
And one evening, when Katie called Thad's house and got his roommate instead, she finally heard the heartbreaking truth.
They said, "Katie, he's not here. He's not living here." I said, "What do you mean he's not living here?" They said, he's moved in with another woman. They told me that her name was Tiffany, and she was an intern at NASA. I was shocked. I was hurt. He promised me he would never do it again. He said he wanted to be with me, and now he's living with another woman.
And I remember Katie telling me that I'm done, I'm finally done, and I'm taking off my ring this time, and I'm going to file for divorce.
Katie immediately hopped on a plane to Houston to confront Thad in person and break it off with him for good.
So I flew down over July 4th weekend, and he told me that he loved me, he wanted to be with me, that I didn't understand his relationship with Tiffany. He was using her for something. And I told him, I says, "Well, I gave you an ultimatum the first time you cheated on me. And when you get back home, we're going to get divorced."
But when Katie returned home, Thad bombarded her with phone calls, declaring his love and begging her to reconsider.
Dad would call her and call her and call her and call her, just always trying to persuade her because he could tell that she had changed. She felt like he was almost stalking her.
I didn't want to take him back because I should have learned the first time, once a cheater, always a cheater.
But before Katie could start divorce proceedings, she received a phone call that completely blew her away.
On July 22nd, I received a collect call on the phone. It was a Sunday, and I was just at my home, and it said from Thad. And that didn't really make sense, but I accepted the charges anyways. And on the phone, he told me that he was calling me from prison. And I said, "What are you doing in prison?" And he said, "Well, I stole moon rocks from NASA, and I tried to sell them, and the FBI caught me." And I said, "You did what?"
Thad had attempted to pull off the most outrageous heist in NASA history.
His ultimate goal was to make a lot of money. The samples that Thad stole were samples from every Apollo mission that landed on the moon.
In the summer of 2002, Katie Wilson's life resembled a bizarre, space-age thriller. Her husband, Thad Roberts, had been arrested for stealing moon rocks from NASA.
That's not a phone call you would ever think you were going to get. And then I just started thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow. This is going to be all over the news. What is my life going to be like tomorrow?
As the story of Thad's ill-conceived caper came to light, Katie couldn't believe her husband's gall. It seemed Thad had come up with the idea to steal moon rocks after seeing the collection at his mentor Everett Gibson's NASA office.
Thad Roberts felt like he could acquire some moon rock specimens, and he asked his friend Gordon McWhorter, a student friend of his from the University of Utah, if he could put out some feelers on the internet and see if he could find a potential buyer for these moon rocks.
Thad and Gordon cooked up an online alias, Orb Robinson, which they used to correspond with a number of potential buyers. One of the people they contacted was a Belgian mineral collector named Axel Emmerman.
Axel Emmerman must have known that the sale of moon rocks would be illegal.
Emmerman tipped off the FBI, and the Bureau set up an undercover operation.
We directed Axel to send a few emails expressing interest and to say that he was not able to travel to the United States to facilitate this sale. However, he had a brother and sister-in-law in the United States.
FBI Special Agent Nick Nance took on the role of the sister-in-law.
My undercover name was Lynn Briley. I took over the email correspondence between Thad and Axel Emmerman's sister-in-law, which was, in effect, me.
Thinking he had a buyer, Thad enlisted 2 female interns to help him pull off the heist. One of his accomplices was his girlfriend, Tiffany Fowler.
Thad broke into Building 31 at Johnson Space Center, broke into Dr. Gibson's office, and then took out a 600 and some odd pound safe, loaded it into a Jeep Cherokee, and then took it to a hotel. They had to resort to wheeling out the safe because Thad was unable to open the safe by the combination.
A few days later, Thad and Tiffany drove their loot to Orlando, where they thought they were meeting Gordon and the prospective buyers. But instead of walking away with a big bag of money, on July 20th, 2002, Thad and his accomplices were taken away in handcuffs.
We arrested them in the parking lot of that hotel. What we found in the hotel room was a tackle box which contained all of the moon rocks that they had taken from Dr. Gibson's laboratory, along with some Martian meteorites that were also in the safe that they had stolen.
Federal authorities estimated that while priceless because of their research potential, the moon rocks were worth a staggering $21 million. But that wasn't all. Thad Roberts had been up to much, much more.
Well, subsequent to Thad's arrest, he and Katie's home was searched, and we found dinosaur bones and some other fossils that he had stolen from the Utah Museum of Natural History, where he had previously worked.
The authorities immediately confiscated the stolen relics and returned them to their rightful owners. Meanwhile, Katie was stunned to learn the extent of her husband's deception.
So he told me that he had received a lot of those fossils and rocks from the museum that the professors had given him because they liked him so much, when it turns out that those were pieces he actually had stole.
In December of 2002, Thad Roberts pleaded guilty to the charge of theft of U.S. government property. And in October of the following year, he was sentenced to 100 months in prison. Even from his prison cell, Thad still tried to find a way to stay in Katie's life.
When he was in prison, he refused to sign my divorce papers. He kept sending me letters telling me how much he loved me. I think he wrote me a letter almost every day, and he would just send them to me in bulk.
After 4 months of stalling, Thad sent the one piece of mail Katie did want to receive from him, and their divorce was finalized in November of 2002. With Thad and his unfortunate space odyssey firmly behind her, the now confident Katie embraces the joys and challenges of her new life.
Katie learned from that relationship that she can be a strong, independent woman, and she can do what she wants.
And today, Katie is once again over the moon, a happily married mother of a 4-year-old girl.
My life now is definitely more fulfilling. I'm happier. I'm healthier than I've ever been. I have a faith that totally fulfills me. My husband now, James, I met him at the gym. So I actually have Thad to thank for that. Because had he not said the things to me that he said or pushed me in the directions that he pushed me into, I never would have tried to better myself.
Andy Nash thought British contractor Simon Reed was her cup of tea.
I really felt like I was falling for him in a very short amount of time.
But just as the party was getting started, Simon vanished.
We were shocked. We didn't know if he was dead, if he was missing.
And as the pieces of Simon's life fell into place,
I knew that was Simon, and I almost fell off the chair.
Andy was forced to realize that the gent she loved
We all wanted to confront him.
had never really existed at all.
I was so devastated. I could barely speak, and I was just kind of in shock.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. They say there are plenty of fish in the sea, but Andy Nash always seemed to come up empty-handed.
I was 34. I had had a series of relationships. I was engaged twice, but nothing had really stuck. Nothing seemed to work out.
So by June of 2008, the Minneapolis local decided she was done fishing in shallow waters.
I think Andy was looking for a life mate, someone she could be in a long-term relationship with.
And one day that month, Andy got her first bite.
A friend of mine who was doing some online dating came across a profile that she thought I'd like.
Andy joined the website and soon found herself browsing the profile named Loving a Full Life.
His name is Simon Reed. There was a picture of him with a dog, and he was handsome, and I believe it said he was looking for a serious relationship.
Ready to test the waters, Andy sent Simon a brief message, and just days later, she got a response that had her grinning from ear to ear.
He just sent me a quick, friendly email saying, I'd love to get together for tea or something sometime. We ended up arranging to meet, and we actually met at a pub. I felt like for a first date, there was a lot of chemistry.
The attraction seemed mutual, as Simon opened up about events from his past.
He had been married before in England, and he said he had been in the States about 7 years.
Simon told Andy that he owned part of a construction company. He was very charming, very friendly, outgoing, very easy to get along with.
Simon seemed like a great catch. And as the following week went by, Simon and Andy began making plans for a second date. When suddenly Simon called with shocking news.
A drunk driver had apparently plowed through his fence and hit the front of his house. He was pretty frustrated about all the damages and the construction work they'd have to do. In the meantime, he was going to be staying with a friend of his.
Even without a roof over his head, Simon continued to court Andy. Just days later, he took her on a romantic picnic.
When we got in his truck at the beginning of the second date, he handed me a letter. In the letter, Simon said that he hadn't felt a connection like this with anyone in a long time. And the letter closed with, I know it's a bit early and, we don't know each other that well, but I really feel like I'm falling in love with you. I was starting to fall for him in a big way as well.
For Andy, this was the whirlwind romance she'd been waiting for. But Simon would prove to be slippery when wet, and he would disappear from her life just as swiftly as he had entered it. 2 months later, in August of 2008, Andy Nash was beside herself with worry. She had been expecting Simon for dinner that night, but he was nowhere to be found.
I spent the night texting Simon, and the next day, I woke up, looked at my phone, no messages.
One day passed, and then another, with no word from Simon. He had disappeared for a day or two before, but to Andy, something about this time felt strangely different.
I had a feeling in the pit of my stomach that something horrible happened to him. He could be dead, he could be injured.
As the days passed, Andy had no idea if she would ever see her boyfriend again. Little did she know that fate was about to bring Simon back in the most unexpected way.
Nobody really had any idea what was going on.
I would have never thought something like this would happen to someone that I know.
In June of 2008, 2 months before Andy Nash's boyfriend Simon Reed went missing, her relationship with the handsome Englishman was in full swing.
The relationship with Simon was progressing really fast. He was right there with me, and he was always saying, you know, how happy he was and how excited he was to have met me.
Simon seemed nothing short of perfect, and Andy delighted in showing him off to her close friends.
I thought he was completely charming, very outgoing, just an all-around, genuine, nice guy.
Andy looked forward to a summer of love. And as the 4th of July weekend approached, Andy and Simon made plans to see the fireworks. But that evening, when Simon didn't show up, Andy became concerned.
Andy was worried, and she was kind of upset. She was afraid something happened to him because it was so out of character for him not to call.
I didn't hear from Simon until the next day. He called me, apologized profusely, and said that he actually had had an accident at the work site. He had fallen from the roof of a building he was working on, and he had to go to the emergency room.
Although initially upset, Andy felt her anger melt away as Simon pleaded for her forgiveness.
I felt bad for him. I was like, I'm sorry I was so angry about it. I'm sorry that I overreacted.
And if Simon felt the need to apologize further, he let his wallet do the talking.
One day, Simon showed up at my apartment and said, you know, I would like to take you shopping today. When all was said and done, he ended up spending $500.
As the hours turned into days, the charming boyfriend Andy had fallen for seemed to be back. But Simon wasn't done wowing Andy just yet. At dinner one night, he made a romantic confession.
Simon looked at me and said, you won't be my girlfriend forever. I am the marrying kind. And that was pretty much what I wanted to hear from him.
Andy thought she had finally hooked her perfect mate.
The relationship definitely was a whirlwind romance. I really felt like I was falling for him in a very short amount of time.
But just when everything seemed too good to be true, Simon's bad luck would strike once again.
Simon called me one day. He was frantic. His dog had just been hit by a car, and he was rushing his dog to the vet, just called me so I would know what was going on.
A dog lover herself, Andy understood Simon's heartache.
They were doing surgery on him, trying to save him. So it was pretty tense. I was pretty worried, and he was, texting me throughout the night.
Simon promised to check back in throughout the day. But as the hours rolled past, Andy received no further word from her man.
I texted him, just please get in touch, let me know what's happening. I'm worried about you, I'm worried about the dog.
Over a day later, after multiple unanswered messages, Simon finally resurfaced on Andy's doorstep. He looked exhausted, but Andy was ready for some answers.
I was pretty angry, and he was like, wait, back off a little bit. I can't handle being yelled at. I've had a horrible few days. And I said, look, I don't like you going silent like this. It kind of makes me panic.
Simon was very apologetic when Andy told him that he needed to communicate better. And, of course, he promised he would do so.
Simon Reed appeared to be a man of his word. But sometimes promises are impossible to keep.
I had no idea where he was. I didn't know what had happened. I just felt completely used.
We all had our own suspicions that something wasn't quite right.
By the summer of 2008, Andy Nash was once again consoling her boyfriend of 2 months, Simon Reed. Simon's latest emergency was an injured dog that had caused him not to return any of Andy's messages for almost 2 days.
He did seem to be genuinely sorry. He stayed over for a little bit, and he ended up having to leave early in the morning. He seemed to be really in a hurry.
But as dusk settled into night, Simon Reed was once again nowhere to be found.
The next day, I woke up, looked at my phone, no messages, no texts, and I thought, something definitely isn't right this time.
I was worried about him that something had happened, but given his track record, it just seemed really sketchy at that point.
When another day came and went without a peep from Simon, Andy's worry turned to anger.
I figured out I didn't know Simon Reed at all. I didn't know where he really lived. I didn't know a lot of things about him.
Andy wasn't sure what to think. Until a day later, when she got an answer she never expected.
My cell phone rang. There was a woman on the phone, and she said, "Is this Andy? Is Simon with you?" And I said, "No, I don't know where he is. I've been looking for him. Do you know anything?" And she said, "No, I'm actually looking for him too. I'm Simon's wife." It was like being punched in the stomach. It was such a blow.
Andy tried to keep her composure as Simon's suspicious behavior suddenly became clear.
His wife said that on 4th of July, when he had supposedly fallen off a building, she and Simon had actually gone out of town to see some of her relatives that day.
Simon's wife also informed Andy that no drunk driver had ever crashed into their home, nor had their dog been involved in any sort of accident. It seemed that Andy's boyfriend was nothing more than a charming liar.
Andy called me crying, and I was in complete shock. I just kept thinking, how dare he? What kind of person does that to someone else?
All of a sudden, with one phone call, everything was over. It was a big shock to my system.
After a long cry and a big glass of wine, Andy decided the best way to get closure with Simon Reed was where their relationship started. Online.
I'd had a blog going for quite a few years, so I took to my blog and I put up a picture of Simon and I said, "This is Simon Reed. This is what he's done. Just watch out for him." And it was very cathartic.
Andy hoped her blog would help other women wise up to Simon's lies. And just 9 months later, Andy would learn that her actions had indeed paid off.
One day I got a comment that said, "My name is Joe. I live in England. I've actually just been done in by Simon Reed."
Also a victim of Simon's tall tales, Joe had come across Andy's blog during an internet search. As the two women exchanged emails, pieces of the Simon Reed puzzle began to fall into place.
He had fled to the UK after ditching me and his wife. And Joe was living in England, had met Simon, and she gave him money to start up his rock climbing business.
I offered him the use of my card, which people may consider foolish, but when you think you're getting married, at some point you share money and you share bank accounts, and that's what I thought we were doing.
But before Joe knew it, Simon had disappeared and taken around $26,000 of her money with him.
It was almost kind of a relief to have, oh, I'm not the only one that this happened to.
Both Joe and Andy wondered how many other women could be out there. And they wouldn't have to wait long. Another email was about to set an entire ambush plan in motion.
There was no hesitation for catching Simon.
The last thing he expected was to have these women find each other and come together and pounce.
By the summer of 2010, 2 years after Simon Reed had mysteriously disappeared on his girlfriend, Andy Nash, Andy had good reason to still be thinking about her ex.
I decided to put everything out there on my blog, and I got an interesting email from a woman in England called Jo. She had been swindled out of a lot of cash from Simon.
Joe's email had been shocking, but what came next was the biggest surprise of all.
The next time I heard from anyone, it was roughly about a year later. There was another comment on my blog from someone new named Nicola saying, "Oh my God, I think I'm dating this guy right now."
I thought Simon was a trustworthy guy until about maybe 3 weeks into our relationship. I started to think that I didn't really know who Simon was, and I decided that I would start to do an internet search. As soon as I put Minnesota and his name into the search engine, he popped up on Sandy's blog.
Since Nicola lived in England with Simon's current information, and Joe had been desperately trying to track him down, Andy introduced the two women over email.
Once Sandy gave me Joe's contact information, we chatted on the phone, and then we made a plan that we would meet up and somehow catch Simon out.
But before the women could begin hatching their plan, another shocking encounter would leave them speechless.
The friend that I'd been with the night I found Simon on the internet, she had spoken to a friend of hers, and her friend said, "Oh, hold on a minute, I think my friend is dating Simon too."
The woman's name was Laura, and not only was she dating Simon, but she lived right down the street from Nicola. With Joe's consent, Nicola immediately went to talk to Laura.
I took my camera and I said to her, "I'll just show you a picture of me and Simon." And she just looked at the picture and she said, "Yeah, that's my Simon."
Nicola asked Laura if she would like to be involved in their plan to unmask Simon.
Laura was straight away, "Yeah, I want to be in on it. How could you do this to me?"
The women knew that action was key if they wanted to catch the elusive Simon. That same night, their plan took shape.
We hatched a plan to meet Simon at Laura's house because she was due to see him the following night.
Nicola then arranged for a journalist friend to videotape the entire confrontation.
I was kind of wishing that I could be there too. It sounded very dramatic and exciting.
On August 5th, 2010, the women gathered at Laura's house in nervous anticipation of Simon's arrival.
My son sat in the car outside with the mobile and was warning us when he walked up the street.
Simon came in. I think he generally just let himself in, and she greeted him, with a normal kiss and, "How's your day, darling?" And she asked him to go through and put the kettle on.
But as Simon came through the kitchen door, he got the surprise of his life.
As he saw me, he just stopped in his tracks and just said, "Oh, hello."
Hello.
And then the cameraman said, "Is there anyone else that we should know about?" And Simon said no. And then he heard footsteps behind him and he turned around to see Joe.
You could see his heart beating quite a lot through his t-shirt. And I think really he just looked really pathetic. I paid £350 for your gym membership. I gave you 1,400 quid out of my credit card. I can't go on a holiday this year because I don't have any money.
As the women grilled Simon for the next 2 hours, the man who had once seemed impossible to pin down was now surprisingly stagnant.
He'd never once asked to leave in all that time. Simon said that he basically didn't know why he does the things that he does.
You're saying sorry to any of you, it's stupid.
No, because you're not sorry.
I don't really know what the truth is from you.
Couldn't give us any answers. I suppose you want to think that you were the special one out of everybody there, that he must have loved you a little bit more than them, but he didn't.
He tries to keep us all happy by telling us things that we want to hear, knowing that he can't fulfill any of the things that he tells you he's going to do.
Other than being a liar, Simon claimed he was an innocent man.
Simon actually asked after the 2 hours for the police to be called.
I think at that point, are the police coming?
I think Simon was willing to turn himself in because possibly all of his lies had come out.
I don't go into it on people.
You do,
I don't.
And I think probably at that point, he didn't think he'd actually done anything legally wrong.
But Simon Reed was wrong. The video evidence showed him confessing to borrowing money from Joe with the promise to pay her back from investments he never really had. Police immediately arrested Simon and charged him with fraud.
I think that justice was served, but to be honest, it won't stop him from doing it again.
In November of 2010, Simon Reed was arraigned in Plymouth, England on fraud by deception charges. And in March of 2011, he was sentenced to 30 months in jail. Thousands of miles away, Andy Nash felt a sense of closure.
I feel that it's a just punishment. I can say that I hope he learns a lesson from it, but I don't really know if that's possible.
If you do love, don't do the stuff you do.
I don't think I know what love is.
Today, Andy Nash has moved well beyond Simon Reed.
I've learned from this experience, if someone seems too good to be true, they probably are.
More importantly, Andy didn't allow her experience with Simon to sour her search for a life partner.
I'm with a man now he's wonderful, he's charming, he's nice, but most importantly, he's not married.
Across the pond, Simon's other ladies have also moved forward.
I fought the credit card company. In the end, I probably lost about £5,000, so that's not as bad as 17,000, which is what it was.
I think the good things that came out of this, karma can catch up with anyone, so be careful.
The phone rings after midnight, sharp and wrong, cutting through a small Illinois police station that has learned to sleep with one eye open, and on the other end is a voice that sounds older than it should, thin but steady, saying a name that hasn't been spoken out loud in years, a name tied to a winter road, a stalled car, a young woman who never made it home. And the officer listening feels the same chill crawl up his spine that the town felt back in 1979, when the snow fell hard and the headlines came fast, and the word cold case didn't exist yet, but everyone already knew what it meant. It began on a Thursday night, the kind of night people remember because nothing was supposed to happen, the kind of night that gets burned into memory because everything went wrong, when headlights were last seen cutting through drifting snow on Route 51 and then vanished, leaving behind silence, tire tracks filling slowly with white, and a sense that something had slipped loose and would not be caught again easily. She was 22, worked late, known by first name at the diner and by smile at the gas station, the sort of person a town claims as its own without ever saying it out loud, and when she didn't show up the next morning, the absence was louder than any alarm. Deputies searched ditches and fields, friends retraced routes, radios crackled with false hope, and then the car was found, doors unlocked, purse still inside, keys gone. The radio frozen between stations as if someone had turned the dial in a hurry, and the snow around it was too smooth, too clean, like the ground itself was refusing to testify. The first headlines were cautious, then sharp, then accusatory, missing woman, mysterious disappearance, community on edge, and within days the town learned how quickly fear can replace routine, how doors get locked earlier, how every passing truck sounds suspicious when the night is quiet enough. Investigators worked the angles they always do, ex-boyfriends, co-workers, anyone who had reason or opportunity. But 1979 was a different era, an era of paper files and hunches, of interviews recorded on tape that would later hiss and fade, and the case sprawled fast. Too many tips, not enough proof, rumors spreading quicker than facts, a man seen at a bar, a scream someone thought they heard over the wind, a vehicle that didn't belong, descriptions that shifted with every retelling. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and the missing posters curled at the edges, sun-bleached and forgotten, while the case file grew heavier and colder, accumulating dust and unanswered questions, a weight no one wanted to lift anymore. The town learned to live with it, the way towns do, by building routines around the absence, by lowering their voices when they passed the spot on the road, by teaching their children the story as a warning without ever admitting that they were still scared. Detectives retired, evidence rooms moved, memories dulled, and the case slipped into that quiet category that doesn't make the front page, but never really goes away. The unsolved, the unresolved, the cold case that waits patiently for someone to make a mistake. Years later, New faces opened the file and tried to read the past through yellowed pages, tracing timelines that refused to line up, listening to old tapes where witnesses sounded more confident than the facts allowed, and they found the same thing their predecessors did: gaps, contradictions, and a sense that the truth had been standing just out of reach all along. There were manwa KY law that never quite fit, a glove found miles away, a receipt with no timestamp, a tip phoned in by someone who wouldn't give a name, each one a spark that flared and died, leaving investigators staring at the dark again. The family waited, learning the cruel rhythm of hope and disappointment, every call from the police a potential answer, every anniversary a reopening of wounds that never healed, and when technology advanced and DNA became the new miracle, they allowed themselves to believe that science might succeed where time had failed. Evidence was retested, databases searched, comparisons run again and again, but the results came back inconclusive, partial, not enough, the modern equivalent of a shrug, and the case remained what it had always been, a story without an ending. Then, decades later, the phone rang, and the voice on the line didn't ask questions or hedge its words. It said, "I was there." It said, "I know what happened." It said, "I've been carrying this for a long time," and suddenly the past was breathing again, close enough to feel. Investigators listened, recorded, asked careful questions, aware of the long history of false confessions and desperate lies, but the details were unsettlingly precise. A turn in the road that never made the reports, a smell in the air that night, a choice that couldn't be undone, and as the hours passed, the room felt smaller, heavier, like the walls themselves were leaning in to hear. News traveled fast, faster than it had in 1979, and by morning the town was buzzing with a word it hadn't dared to use before: solved, a word that promised closure and delivered shock instead, because the name attached to the confession wasn't a stranger or a drifter or a monster from outside. It was someone woven into the fabric of the place, someone who had aged alongside the case, attended funerals, nodded politely in grocery store aisles, and the realization hit like a second disappearance. A reminder that the danger everyone feared had never left at all. It had been living quietly among them, waiting for the moment when the truth could no longer stay buried. The confession doesn't arrive like an explosion. It creeps in, sentence by sentence, detail by detail, the kind of truth that seeps under the door and fills the room before anyone realizes they're drowning in it, and the investigators sitting across the table feel the years collapse as the voice continues, steady now, almost relieved, describing that night not as a headline or a rumor, but as a sequence of moments that can no longer be edited or softened. Outside, the town is waking up to the news, radios murmuring, phones lighting up, neighbors standing in driveways pretending not to listen while absorbing every word, because the idea that this cold case might finally be solved is intoxicating and terrifying at the same time, a promise that comes with a price. The confession pulls them back to Route 51, to the way the snow reflected the headlights, to the sound of tires losing grip, to a car slowing down for a vehicle pulled awkwardly to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking like a quiet plea for help, and the investigators exchange glances, because none of this was ever in the reports. None of it made it into the official timeline that had been dissected for decades. He talks about stopping, about the decision that felt small in the moment, about walking up to the driver's side window and seeing fear flicker across her face before she masked it with politeness, and that detail alone sends a ripple through the room, because it reframes everything, turning a missing person case into a story of chance, of the wrong encounter at exactly the wrong time. The confession doesn't rush. It lingers, describing the cold biting through gloves, the wind cutting words short, the way the radio hissed when the engine was turned off, and each sensory detail tightens the knot in the investigators' chests, because this is how real memories sound, messy and vivid, and impossible to rehearse. He says her name once, quietly, and that single syllable feels heavier than the years of silence that preceded it. A reminder that this was never just a case number or a headline. It was a person whose life was interrupted mid-sentence. As he speaks, the past becomes less abstract, the missing posters peeling in the sun, the candlelight vigils, the whispered theories, all of it snapping into a sharper, more brutal focus. The investigators ask about the car, about why it was left the way it was, about the keys that were never found. And the answers come without hesitation, a choreography of fear and impulse that explains the inexplicable, the unlocked doors, the purse untouched, the radio frozen between stations because it was never turned off properly, just abandoned in the rush of something going terribly wrong. This is the point where the room changes, where skepticism gives way to something closer to certainty, because coincidences don't stack this neatly, and lies rarely carry this much weight. Outside, reporters are already circling, cameras poised, headlines half-written, because the phrase "cold case solved" is irresistible, a promise of justice served, of history corrected, and yet inside the station the mood is anything but triumphant. There's a tension that hangs in the air, a recognition that solving a case this old doesn't restore what was lost, it just rearranges the grief, moving it from the unknown to the unbearable clarity of knowing exactly what happened and who is responsible. The confession continues, threading through the years that followed, the nights spent replaying the moment, the way ordinary life resumed around an extraordinary secret, jobs taken, families raised, holidays celebrated with a ghost always sitting just out of sight. He talks about watching the investigation from a distance, about reading the headlines with a mix of dread and relief every time a new suspect was named, because as long as the blame pointed elsewhere, the truth stayed buried. He remembers the town meetings, the safety lectures, the parents gripping their children's hands a little tighter, and he says it felt like the community was building walls around a danger that had already passed through, already settled in, invisible and patient. The investigators listen without interrupting, aware that every word is another brick in a structure that has been missing for 46 years, a structure that will now have to support the weight of accountability. They ask why now, why after all this time, and the answer is unsatisfying in the way real answers often are, a combination of aging, illness, the erosion of fear, and a sense that the truth has its own gravity, pulling itself to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. He mentions dreams, the same scene replaying with different endings, the road stretching on forever, the snow never melting, and that detail resonates because it mirrors the town's experience exactly, trapped in a loop of unanswered questions and unresolved loss. As the hours pass, the confession becomes less about the act itself and more about the aftermath, the way time distorted the memory, sanding down some edges while sharpening others, the way guilt learned to coexist with routine until it became background noise, always present but rarely acknowledged. When the recording stops, there's a moment of silence that feels almost ceremonial, like the closing of a door that has been open too long, and the investigators know that what comes next will be just as complicated as what they've just heard. Evidence will have to be matched, statements corroborated, the legal machinery carefully reassembled to handle a case that predates most of the people now involved in it. There will be questions about why it took so long, about missed opportunities, about whether justice delayed can ever really be justice at all, and those questions will echo loudly in a town that thought it had made peace with not knowing. Word spreads quickly, faster than the official statements can keep up, and by the end of the day the story has escaped the confines of the station, transformed into breaking news, into scrolling text and urgent tones. Illinois 1979 cold case solved. Confession shocks investigators and victims' families, a sentence that feels both definitive and profoundly inadequate. Families who lived with the uncertainty for decades are suddenly faced with a different kind of pain, the pain of specificity, of having a name and a face to attach to their grief. And for some, the revelation is almost too much to process. They remember him as he was then, or as he became, and the dissonance is brutal. The realization that the person who offered condolences, who stood shoulder to shoulder at memorials, may have been carrying the truth the entire time. The community reacts in waves, disbelief giving way to anger, anger softening into a weary sadness, because there is no reaction that fits neatly when the past collides with the present this violently. Streets that once felt safe take on a new texture, familiar places acquire an afterimage, and the road where it all began becomes a landmark of a different kind, a reminder that ordinary nights can hide extraordinary horror. Inside the investigation, The focus shifts from searching to proving, from speculation to documentation, and every step forward feels like a step through a minefield of old mistakes and fragile memories. The confession has opened the door, but it hasn't closed the case yet, and as night falls again over the town, the same winter wind rattles the same windows, carrying with it the unsettling knowledge that the truth, once uncovered, doesn't bring silence. It brings echoes that will linger far longer than the mystery ever did. Morning light doesn't soften the story, it sharpens it, exposing every edge the darkness allowed to blur, and as investigators return to the file with fresh eyes, the confession sits at the center like a gravitational pull, bending everything around it, forcing old evidence, old statements, old assumptions to realign or break. Boxes are opened that haven't been touched in decades, folders creak as if protesting the disturbance, and the smell of paper and dust fills the room while names from the past rise again, no longer ghosts, but pieces in a pattern that might finally make sense. The road maps are laid out first, creased and annotated by hands long retired, and suddenly the route that once seemed ordinary becomes charged, every curve and intersection now a potential turning point, every mile marker a silent witness. Investigators retrace the timeline hour by hour, comparing the confession's account with weather reports, radio logs, and witness statements that once felt too vague to be useful, and the alignment is unsettling, like watching two separate films snap into sync. Snowfall records confirm the conditions described. A patrol log notes a vehicle stopped briefly near the same stretch of road, dismissed at the time as routine, and that small, overlooked detail lands with disproportionate force. Reminder that cold cases aren't built on a single failure, but on 1,000 moments where certainty was just out of reach. The car becomes the focal point again. Photographs spread across the table, grainy but damning in their stillness, and what once looked random now feels deliberate. The way it was angled, the distance from the road, the absence of struggle inside paired with signs of haste outside. The confession explains the contradictions investigators wrestled with for years. Why there were no skid marks, why no one heard anything definitive, why the scene felt staged without ever looking overtly manipulated. It's not that the evidence was wrong, it's that the story to connect it didn't exist yet. Outside the station, the narrative is hardening into something more rigid, more dangerous, as speculation fills the gaps between official statements, neighbors replaying old interactions through a new lens, every memory now suspect. People who thought they had made peace with the past find themselves scanning their own histories, asking where they were that night, what they noticed, what they dismissed, and the collective memory of the town shifts, becoming less about what happened and more about how close it was allowed to come. The investigators know this phase well, the moment when a solved cold case threatens to fracture a community all over again, because clarity doesn't just illuminate the crime, it exposes the years of proximity to it. They move carefully, aware that every confirmation, every leaked detail, carries weight beyond the courtroom, and yet the machinery of justice has its own momentum now, fed by the confession and hungry for corroboration. They track down witnesses who once spoke in hypotheticals and ask them to speak again, this time with names attached, and the responses are uneven, some memories flooding back with painful clarity, others resisting, warped by time and self-preservation. One recalls a truck idling where it shouldn't have been. Another remembers a man unusually agitated at a bar later that night. Details that once seemed too thin to matter now slot into place with uncomfortable ease. The passage of time complicates everything. Alibis crumble because the people who could confirm them are gone. Records are incomplete, and the investigators are forced to build a case that can survive scrutiny despite its age. They lean on what remains solid, physical evidence preserved against the odds, fibers, fragments, traces that technology can finally coax into speech, and each lab result feels like a conversation across decades, the past responding at last. The confession is dissected line by line, not just for truth, but for motive, for intent, for the legal thresholds that separate admission from proof, and the man's words, once raw and unfiltered, are now parsed with clinical precision. He doesn't recant, doesn't embellish, doesn't ask for mercy, and that consistency becomes its own kind of evidence, a through line that resists the erosion of doubt. Meanwhile, The family is pulled into a new orbit, meeting with investigators, hearing details they were spared before, faces tightening as the abstract becomes personal in ways it never was when the case was just unsolved. They grapple with conflicting impulses, relief that the waiting might finally end, and a fresh surge of grief as the specifics settle in, because knowing how and why doesn't lessen the loss, it just gives it sharper edges. The phrase "cold case solved" rings hollow in those rooms, too neat for the mess of emotions it's supposed to contain. In town halls and living rooms, the conversation turns toward accountability, not just of the accused but of the system itself. Questions bubbling up about missed signs, about whether someone should have known sooner, about the cost of delays measured not in years, but in lives lived under false assumptions. Investigators feel that pressure too, the unspoken accusation that time itself is a kind of accomplice, and they push harder, determined not to let the case unravel under its own weight. The confession leads them to a location never searched properly, a patch of land written off early on, and even after all these years, the ground yields answers, small, fragile confirmations that bridge the gap between story and fact. It's enough to shift the balance, enough to move the case from possibility to probability, and the legal process begins to loom larger, a future courtroom already echoing in their minds. News updates shift tone, from shocked curiosity to grim certainty, and the community's reaction evolves again, anger now more focused, grief more directed, because uncertainty has been replaced by a target. Yet there's an undercurrent of unease that doesn't dissipate, a sense that the resolution, when it comes, will be incomplete, because no verdict can rewind the years or restore the trust that was quietly eroded along the way. As night falls for the third time since the confession, investigators sit alone with the file, now thicker than ever, and consider the strange symmetry of it all, a case born in winter returning to life under the same cold sky, the same roads stretching out beyond the town, indifferent to human drama. The snow from 1979 is long gone, melted into the ground and carried away, but its imprint remains in the collective memory, preserved like evidence that can never be fully cleared. The confession has answered the central question, but it has opened others, about how people live with secrets, about how communities absorb trauma and keep functioning, about the thin line between the ordinary and the catastrophic. And as the investigators prepare for the next phase, aware that the hardest work may still lie ahead, the case settles into a new identity, no longer just a mystery, but a mirror held up to everyone who lived alongside it, reflecting a truth that is as unsettling as it is long overdue. The legal machinery wakes slowly, like something ancient stretching its joints, and every movement sends a tremor through the town because this is the moment when rumor gives way to record, when whispers are replaced by sworn statements, and the weight of the past is measured in exhibits and transcripts. Prosecutors step into rooms lined with boxes older than some of the people handling them, reading through reports written on typewriters, margins crowded with notes from men and women who never imagined this day would come. The confession is no longer just a voice on tape. It's a document, annotated, cross-referenced, tested against everything that survived the years, and with each comparison the outline of that winter night grows darker, more precise, less forgiving. They map the movements described, minute by minute, and discover that what once looked like gaps are actually overlaps, moments when the truth brushed up against the investigation and slid past unnoticed. A gas station receipt, long dismissed because it lacked a time stamp, suddenly fits when paired with a shift schedule and a weather delay. A call logged without content gains meaning when aligned with the confession's timeline. It's not a single revelation that changes everything, it's the accumulation, the quiet horror of realizing how close the case came to resolution over and over again without ever quite tipping the scale. The accused is brought in under fluorescent lights that hum softly, a sound that becomes part of the memory whether anyone wants it to or not, and his face looks different now than it did in old photographs, softened by age, lined by years that carried the secret forward even as the world moved on. He listens as the evidence is laid out, not with surprise but with a kind of resigned attention, as if he's watching a story finally catch up to its ending. When asked to clarify details, he does, sometimes correcting the record, sometimes filling in blanks investigators didn't know were there, and the steadiness of it all is unsettling, because there's no dramatic breakdown, no sudden reversal, just a slow, relentless confirmation that this version of events has been living inside him for a very long time. Outside, cameras capture fragments, a profile, a handcuffed wrist, and those images circulate instantly, collapsing decades of speculation into a single, undeniable reality. People stare at screens in silence, recognizing features they've seen before in safer contexts, and the shock isn't just that the case is solved, it's that the answer was never an abstraction at all. In the courtroom, the air feels heavier than it should, thick with anticipation and a strange sense of history being rewritten in real time. Legal arguments unfold with careful restraint, acknowledging the age of the case without letting it excuse anything, and every reference to 1979 lands differently now, no longer distant but immediate, as if the year itself has been pulled forward and set down among the present-day faces. Witnesses take the stand and speak into microphones that amplify not just their words but their hesitation, their pauses filled with memories resurfacing against their will. Some voices shake, others harden, and the jury listens to a collage of past and present stitched together by the thread of the confession. The defense raises the questions everyone expects about reliability, about memory, about the dangers of revisiting a cold case with modern assumptions, but even those challenges underline the central truth that the story being told now has a coherence the case never had before. The family sits together, hands folded, eyes fixed forward, absorbing details they never asked for but can no longer avoid, and the experience is described later as both unbearable and necessary, a confrontation with reality that strips away the protective ambiguity of not knowing. Each description of that night reopens wounds, but it also validates years of waiting, years spent wondering if their grief was somehow incomplete without answers. They hear the name of the road spoken aloud, the weather described accurately, the sequence of events laid bare, and for the first time the narrative belongs to them as much as it belongs to the state. There's no relief in the traditional sense, no sudden peace, just a different kind of weight settling in, heavier but more defined, something that can at least be acknowledged openly. When they're asked to speak, their words are measured, not vengeful, carrying a quiet insistence that truth matters even when it arrives late, especially when it arrives late. Outside the courtroom, the town wrestles with its own reflection, the uncomfortable realization that the story of the crime is also a story about itself, about how communities process fear and familiarity, about the assumptions made to preserve a sense of safety. Conversations drift toward missed signs, toward moments that feel significant in hindsight but felt ordinary at the time, and the danger of that thinking becomes clear because hindsight has a way of inventing certainty where there was none. Investigators caution against rewriting the past too neatly, reminding anyone who will listen that the case wasn't ignored. It was pursued within the limits of its era, and yet the tension remains, a collective need to understand how something so devastating could remain unresolved for so long. The phrase cold case solved is repeated endlessly in headlines and broadcasts, but its meaning shifts depending on who's saying it. For some it's closure, for others it's an indictment of time itself. As proceedings continue, expert testimony bridges the gap between then and now, explaining how evidence preserved against the odds can finally speak with clarity, how fragments once too small to matter can now anchor an entire narrative. The science doesn't dramatize the story, it stabilizes it, giving the confession a framework that resists doubt, and that stability is what carries the case forward. The accused listens, occasionally nodding, occasionally looking down, and the absence of denial becomes its own statement, a tacit acknowledgement that the truth has finally outrun the fear that kept it hidden. When the verdict comes, it does so without spectacle, a formal declaration that lands quietly but reverberates outward, reshaping memories and expectations in ways that won't fully settle for years. The town marks the moment in subtle ways, flags at half-staff for some, routine continuing for others, because life doesn't pause even when history shifts beneath it. The road remains where it has always been, plowed and repaved, lined with familiar landmarks, but now it carries an added layer of meaning, a silent archive of what happened and what didn't, of the distance between a stopped car and a life forever altered. People drive it differently now, slower perhaps, or with a glance toward the shoulder where the snow once piled high, and that awareness becomes part of the landscape, an invisible monument more enduring than any plaque. In interviews, investigators speak carefully, aware that their words will be replayed and analyzed, and they emphasize what the case represents beyond its outcome, a testament to persistence, to the idea that unanswered questions can still be answered, even when the trail has gone cold. They also acknowledge the cost, the years of uncertainty, the families who aged alongside the mystery, the community that learned to live with a shadow it never fully understood. The confession didn't just solve a case, it reactivated a collective memory, forcing a reckoning with how time changes both facts and feelings, how justice delayed transforms everyone it touches. As the chapter closes, there's no triumphant music, no clean fade out, just a lingering sense of gravity, the understanding that resolution doesn't erase impact, it reframes it. The Illinois winter of 1979 no longer exists except in photographs and stories, but its echo is unmistakable, carried forward in court records, in personal recollections, in the quiet acknowledgement that some truths wait patiently for the moment when they can no longer be denied. And even as the legal process reaches its end, the emotional aftermath continues, rippling outward through a town that must now learn to live not with uncertainty, but with the knowledge of what was hidden in plain sight for so long, a knowledge that will shape its identity long after the headlines have moved on. After the verdict, the silence is louder than anything that came before it, a vacuum left behind once the machinery of justice powers down and the cameras move on, and in that quiet the town begins the slow, awkward work of recalibration, learning how to exist with answers it once thought it wanted more than anything. The courthouse empties, footsteps echoing off marble floors polished smooth by generations of other endings, and outside the winter air feels thinner somehow, as if the atmosphere itself has been altered by what was just confirmed inside those walls. People don't linger. They disperse quickly, carrying the weight of the decision back into cars, kitchens, workplaces, because resolution doesn't invite celebration, it demands adjustment. The name that once circulated as rumor now carries legal finality, and hearing it spoken aloud in ordinary conversation feels wrong, like repeating a word that still hasn't settled into its new meaning. For decades, the story lived in the conditional if this, maybe that, what if, but now it occupies the present tense, and the shift is disorienting. The family returns home with a strange sense of completion that doesn't resemble relief, their grief no longer suspended but grounded, attached to specifics that can be named even if they still can't be accepted. They sort through old belongings with a new lens, photographs once framed by uncertainty now bordered by clarity, and the memories hit harder because there's no longer a question mark to soften them. They talk about the night again, not as speculation but as history, reconstructing it with the help of what was revealed in court, and each detail is a fresh incision, reopening wounds that time never truly closed. Friends and neighbors offer condolences that sound different now, less tentative, more final, and that difference underscores the strange truth that uncertainty can sometimes feel lighter than certainty, because certainty leaves nowhere to hide. Still, there's a measure of validation in knowing that the waiting wasn't for nothing, that the questions were not foolish, that the truth did exist even when it seemed unreachable. Across town, the ripple effects are subtler, but just as profound, a recalibration of trust that happens in private moments rather than public forums. People revisit old interactions, scanning them for significance, wondering how well they ever truly knew the person at the center of the case, and that exercise proves exhausting, because memory resists such retroactive scrutiny. There's a temptation to rewrite the past, to convince oneself that the signs were obvious, that danger announced itself clearly, but that illusion offers little comfort, because it implies a level of control that never actually existed. The reality is messier and more unsettling, that harm can coexist with normalcy, that routine can camouflage catastrophe, and that realization lingers long after the headlines fade. The town doesn't fracture, but it doesn't return to its previous shape either. It settles into something altered, a version of itself marked by a shared reckoning it didn't choose. Investigators feel the aftershock in their own way, a mixture of professional closure and lingering unease, because closing a case like this doesn't feel like winning. It feels like arriving late to something that should have ended long ago. They review the timeline one last time, not out of necessity but out of habit, tracing the path from disappearance to confession, and they're struck by how fragile the outcome still feels, dependent on a single decision made decades earlier to speak at last. The case becomes a reference point, cited in trainings and discussions about cold cases, about persistence, about the unpredictable nature of breakthroughs, but those conversations rarely capture the emotional residue left behind. Behind every lesson learned is a family that waited, a community that adjusted, and a truth that reshaped both only after extracting a heavy toll. The investigators know this, even if the official record can't fully convey it. The road where it began sees an uptick in traffic, not from curiosity seekers, but from locals driving it with renewed awareness, their gaze drifting to the shoulder where the car once sat, imagining the hazard lights blinking against the snow. There's no memorial, no marker, just the landscape itself holding the memory, and that feels appropriate in a way because the crime didn't announce itself loudly. It slipped into existence quietly, almost politely, the way many of the most devastating events do. Over time, the heightened attention fades, but the association remains, an invisible layer that can't be paved over or plowed away. Parents mention the story to their children not as a cautionary tale but as a reminder, a lesson in vigilance tempered by empathy, because fear alone is too blunt an instrument to carry forward. Media coverage thins out, moving on to fresher stories, and the phrase cold case solved recedes from daily conversation, becoming something people reference rather than relive. Yet the psychological imprint remains, surfacing unexpectedly in moments of stillness. A late-night drive, a news report about another long unsolved crime, a snowfall heavy enough to quiet the world. The case has become part of the town's internal geography, a point of orientation that influences how people understand safety, chance, and time. It serves as a reminder that some stories don't end when they're resolved, they simply change form, shifting from mystery to memory, from question to caution. The accused begins serving a sentence that will outlast public interest, his days now governed by routines that bear no resemblance to the freedom he once enjoyed, and his presence in the news dwindles to brief mentions, legal updates stripped of narrative. There's no grand reckoning, no moment where everything balances out, just the steady passage of time asserting itself once again, this time with fewer unknowns. His confession, once explosive, becomes a matter of record, its emotional charge dissipating as familiarity sets in, and yet the significance of that decision, to finally speak, continues to reverberate quietly. It stands as proof that the past is not inert, that it can be activated by a single act, and that when it is, the consequences ripple far beyond the person who triggered them. In the end, the case settles into a strange equilibrium, neither forgotten nor constantly revisited, a fixed point in the town's collective consciousness. It doesn't offer comfort in the traditional sense, but it provides context, a framework for understanding how something so devastating could happen and remain unresolved for so long. The winter of 1979 is no longer just a year, it's a symbol, shorthand for a convergence of chance, silence, and delayed truth, and its legacy persists in the way people talk about justice, about patience, about the limits of certainty. As the seasons continue to turn, the story remains, quieter now but no less potent, a reminder that some answers arrive only after extracting years of waiting, and that even then, the echoes they leave behind can be as haunting as the questions they finally put to rest. Time resumes its forward motion, indifferent to verdicts and headlines, and the case slips into a quieter phase where its presence is felt more in the subconscious than in daily conversation, a low hum beneath ordinary life. The town adjusts not through grand gestures, but through small, almost invisible shifts, the way people pause a fraction longer at stop signs, the way conversations about safety carry an undertone of realism rather than fear, the way trust is no longer assumed but considered. The story is no longer breaking news, but it hasn't lost its power. it has simply embedded itself deeper, becoming something people carry rather than discuss. In schools, teachers answer questions carefully when a year comes up in history projects, mindful of how close the past still feels, and in homes, parents choose their words with equal care, balancing honesty with the instinct to protect. The case has become a reference point, a silent comparator against which new events are measured, a reminder that certainty is fragile and often temporary. For the investigators who lived with the file for years, the aftermath is marked by a peculiar emptiness, the sudden absence of a problem that once defined their days. They find themselves reaching for the folder out of habit, checking details that no longer need checking, and in that repetition there's a recognition of how deeply the case imprinted itself on their professional identities. Closing it didn't erase the investment, it highlighted it, revealing how much of their time, attention, and emotional bandwidth had been devoted to a question that resisted answers for nearly half a century. Some speak openly about the toll, about the nights spent imagining alternative outcomes, about the frustration of knowing that persistence doesn't always guarantee resolution. Others keep those reflections private, processing them internally as they move on to newer cases that will, inevitably, present their own unanswered questions. The family enters a different stage of mourning, one that doesn't resemble the grief they knew before, because it's no longer fueled by uncertainty, but by an excess of clarity. They're asked to participate in interviews, documentaries, retrospectives that frame the case as a success story, and each request forces a decision, whether to engage and keep the narrative accurate, or to retreat and protect what remains of their private lives. When they do speak, their words are careful, grounded, resisting the temptation to dramatize what has already been dramatized enough. They emphasize the waiting, the years of not knowing, the quiet persistence required to survive that kind of limbo, and in doing so they shift the focus away from the perpetrator and back toward the human cost of unresolved violence. Their perspective complicates the tidy arc of closure that audiences often expect, reminding anyone listening that answers do not cancel loss, they simply coexist with it. In the broader true crime landscape, the case becomes a touchstone, cited alongside other long-dormant investigations that found resolution late in the game. Analysts dissect it for patterns, journalists revisit it for anniversaries, and armchair detectives debate the what-ifs online, constructing alternate scenarios that might have changed the outcome years earlier. Yet even in those discussions, there's an undercurrent of humility, an acknowledgement that hindsight distorts perception, making the improbable seem obvious. The case resists simple lessons, refusing to collapse into a single moral or takeaway, and that resistance is part of what keeps it alive in the public imagination. It stands as evidence that truth is not always loud or urgent, that sometimes it waits quietly until circumstances align, and that alignment can take far longer than anyone expects. The physical artifacts of the investigation are archived once more, this time with a sense of finality that was absent before. Evidence is cataloged not as a promise of future answers, but as a record of how those answers were finally obtained, and the files are labeled accordingly, no longer open, no longer pending. There's something ceremonial about that process, a recognition that the objects once held as potential keys have now fulfilled their purpose. Yet even as they're stored away, their significance lingers, because they represent more than just proof. They represent endurance, the refusal to let a story disappear simply because it became inconvenient or difficult to pursue. In that sense, the archive is less a tomb than a testament, a reminder of what sustained attention can eventually accomplish. The road itself undergoes subtle changes, resurfaced again, lined with new signage, its history invisible to anyone passing through without context. To outsiders, it's just another stretch of asphalt, functional and forgettable. But to those who know the story, it carries an additional dimension, a depth that can't be captured by maps or GPS coordinates. People who drive it for the first time with knowledge of what happened often describe a strange sensation, a heightened awareness that has nothing to do with danger and everything to do with empathy. They imagine the cold, the isolation, the split-second decisions that set everything in motion, and that act of imagining becomes a form of remembrance, quiet but persistent. As years continue to pass, The case settles into the rhythm of anniversaries, moments when it resurfaces briefly in public consciousness before receding again. Each milestone brings a fresh wave of reflection, not just about the crime itself, but about the time that elapsed between its occurrence and its resolution. Those reflections often circle back to the same themes: patience, resilience, the limits of knowledge, and the unpredictable ways in which truth emerges. There's a growing recognition that cold cases occupy a unique psychological space, existing simultaneously in the past and the present, and that solving them doesn't close that space so much as redefine it. The Illinois case becomes emblematic of that dynamic, a reminder that resolution is not an endpoint but a transition. For those who lived through the original investigation, the solved status introduces a new challenge, integrating the final narrative into memories that were shaped by uncertainty. They recall the fear of the early days, the rumors that spread unchecked, the sense of vulnerability that lingered long after the search ended, and now they must reconcile those experiences with the knowledge of what actually happened. That reconciliation is uneven, sometimes smooth, sometimes jarring, depending on how deeply the mystery had embedded itself in their sense of place. Some feel a renewed sense of safety, others feel more cautious than ever, their trust tempered by the understanding that danger can wear a familiar face. Both responses are valid, both rooted in the same revelation, and the town accommodates them without resolution, because emotional landscapes don't require consensus to coexist. The confession, once a singular event, becomes part of a larger narrative about accountability and time, referenced in discussions about ethics, memory, and the psychology of guilt. Experts debate what finally prompted it, whether it was conscience, circumstance, or a gradual erosion of fear, and those debates reveal as much about our collective fascination with motive as they do about the individual who spoke. The truth, as always, resists simplification, existing somewhere between explanation and mystery, and that ambiguity ensures that the case retains a measure of intrigue even after its central question has been answered. It's a reminder that understanding why something happened is often more elusive than understanding how. As the community moves further away from the moment of resolution, the case's influence becomes subtler, but no less significant. It shapes how local law enforcement approaches long-dormant files, reinforcing the idea that no case is ever truly closed until it is, and it shapes how residents think about vigilance and compassion, about the balance between awareness and paranoia. The story is no longer told with urgency, but with gravity, its tone reflecting the lessons learned rather than the shock experienced. It becomes a shared reference, a point of mutual understanding that doesn't need constant explanation. In quiet moments, when the noise of daily life recedes, the echoes of 1979 can still be felt, not as fear, but as a kind of solemn recognition. The knowledge that answers can arrive late but still matter, that truth can surface after decades of silence, and that the act of uncovering it reshapes everyone involved. The Illinois cold case, once defined by absence, now exists as a presence, a completed story that continues to inform the present even as it recedes into history. And in that persistence lies its final impact, not as a mystery solved, but as a testament to the enduring consequences of what happens when a single night alters the course of countless lives, leaving marks that time can soften but never entirely erase. Long after the official statements stop and the transcripts are filed away, the case continues to surface in quieter, more personal ways, appearing where no one expects it, in half-remembered dreams, in the pause before answering a knock at the door, in the sudden awareness that comes with driving alone at night. The town doesn't talk about it much anymore, not because it's forgotten, but because it has been absorbed, folded into the background noise of daily life, where the most powerful stories often end up. People carry it privately, each in their own way, the knowledge settling differently depending on where they stood when it first broke open again. For some, it's a reminder of resilience, proof that time doesn't erase responsibility. For others, it's a caution that certainty is fragile, that the familiar can conceal the unimaginable without ever announcing itself. Local law enforcement feels the ripple effects years later, not as pressure but as posture, a subtle shift in how unresolved cases are treated, how patience is framed not as failure, but as strategy. Detectives speak about the Illinois case in measured tones, using it to underscore the importance of preservation, of documentation done carefully even when leads run dry, because no one can predict which fragment will eventually become decisive. Younger officers listen with a mix of skepticism and reverence, aware that they're inheriting systems built on both success and regret, and that every decision they make might be revisited decades from now by someone else looking for answers. The solved cold case becomes less of a miracle story and more of a disciplined story about what it means to keep something alive without letting it consume everything else. In the community, informal rituals emerge, not sanctioned or organized, but persistent all the same. Someone leaves flowers near the stretch of road every winter, anonymous, brief, a gesture that acknowledges the anniversary without turning it into spectacle. Others mark the date quietly, checking in on the family, lighting a candle, pausing for a moment of reflection before returning to their routines. These acts aren't coordinated, but together they form a pattern, a shared understanding that remembrance doesn't require an audience. The absence of fanfare feels intentional, a rejection of the noise that once surrounded the case, favoring something more restrained, more honest. The family continues to navigate a world that now recognizes their story, but doesn't always understand it. They're approached by strangers who speak in careful tones, expressing sympathy tinged with curiosity, and those interactions are navigated with practiced grace, gratitude mixed with boundaries. They've learned that being the center of a resolved cold case doesn't end public interest, it just changes its texture, replacing speculation with a different kind of attention. Over time, they reclaim the narrative in small ways, emphasizing the life that existed before the crime, the person who is more than the sum of what happened to her. In doing so, they resist the tendency to let tragedy define everything that came before and after. The accused fades from public view almost entirely, his story reduced to a footnote in discussions that increasingly focus elsewhere. This absence is intentional, a quiet acknowledgement that notoriety serves no purpose beyond prolonging harm. His confession remains, unaltered, a fixed point in the record, but the man himself becomes less relevant as the case's meaning evolves. What matters more is the choice he made to speak, the consequences of that choice, and the broader questions it raises about silence, guilt, and the limits of time. Experts continue to debate the psychology behind delayed confessions, citing the Illinois case as an example of how internal pressure can build invisibly, eventually outweighing fear and self-preservation. Yet, even those analyses stop short of certainty, because motive, like memory, resists complete dissection. In academic circles, the case appears in journals and conferences, framed as a study in investigative endurance and the ethics of reopening wounds long thought closed. Scholars argue over terminology, over whether closure is a meaningful concept or a convenient fiction, and the Illinois case is often used to illustrate the ambiguity of that idea. For the family, for the town, closure was never a door that clicked shut. It was a slow shift in weight, a redistribution of pain that made some things clearer and others more complex. That nuance doesn't always survive translation into theory, but it persists in lived experience, shaping how people respond to other cases, other headlines, other promises of resolution. The road remains unchanged, and that constancy becomes symbolic in its own way, a reminder that places outlast events even as they absorb them. Drivers pass through without noticing anything unusual, unaware of the history layered beneath their tires, while those who know feel a subtle pull, an awareness that transforms an ordinary stretch of pavement into something heavier. There's no signage to explain it, no official marker to instruct memory, and that absence allows the story to exist organically, passed along through conversation rather than inscription. It's a living memory, one that adapts as those who remember firsthand age, and those who learn secondhand interpret it through their own contexts. As technology continues to evolve, new tools emerge that promise to solve cases faster, to eliminate the kind of delays that define 1979, and optimism grows alongside those advances. Yet the Illinois case serves as a quiet counterpoint, a reminder that tools alone don't create answers. People do, through persistence, integrity, and the willingness to revisit uncomfortable truths. It tempers enthusiasm with realism, encouraging a balance between innovation and humility. Even with the best resources, some answers will still take time, and some will arrive only when circumstances align in unpredictable ways. The media occasionally revisits the story on major anniversaries, framing it as part of a broader narrative about justice delayed but not denied. Those segments are polished, efficient, designed to fit into neat time slots, and while they capture the outline of events, they rarely convey the slow burn of decades lived under uncertainty. Viewers see the beginning and the end, the disappearance and the confession, but the long middle, the years of waiting and wondering, remain largely invisible. That invisibility mirrors the experience of cold cases themselves, the way they recede from attention without ever fully disappearing, sustained by those who refuse to let them go. Within the town, younger generations grow up knowing the case as history rather than lived experience, and that distance changes its emotional charge. To them, it's a story about the past, something discussed in classrooms or mentioned by parents, not something that shaped their daily sense of safety. This generational shift brings a measure of relief, proof that the community can move forward without being defined entirely by a single event. At the same time, it introduces a responsibility to remember accurately, to preserve the lessons without perpetuating fear, to ensure that the story remains grounded in empathy rather than sensationalism. The investigators who worked the final phase of the case eventually retire, carrying with them the knowledge that their careers intersected with something larger than any single assignment. In interviews and personal reflections, they describe the experience not as a triumph, but as a privilege, the opportunity to finish something that began long before them. They speak about patience, about the importance of listening, about the humility required to accept that answers don't always come on a convenient timeline. Their words contribute to a quiet legacy, influencing how future cases are approached, how long-dormant files are viewed not as burdens, but as responsibilities. In the end, the Illinois 1979 cold case occupies a rare space, resolved yet still resonant, complete but not contained. It exists as a reminder that truth has a lifespan independent of attention, that it can survive neglect and still assert itself when conditions allow. The shock that accompanied its resolution has faded, replaced by a steadier understanding of what it represents, not a victory over time, but a negotiation with it. The town lives on, changed but intact, carrying the story forward not as an open wound, but as a scar, visible enough to remember, healed enough to endure. And in that balance lies the lasting impact of a case that refused to stay buried, proving that even after decades of silence, the past can still speak, and when it does, its voice reshapes everything that follows. With distance comes a different kind of clarity, not the sharp revelation of a confession or a verdict, but the slow understanding that the case has become a lens through which everything else is viewed. New disappearances elsewhere make the news and people in the town listen differently now, hearing echoes in the language reporters use, recognizing the familiar rhythm of uncertainty before it hardens into years. Phrases like "last seen," "no signs of struggle," "police are following several leads" land with a weight that outsiders might miss, because those words once lived here, once stretched into decades. The solved cold case has trained the community to listen between the lines, to understand how fragile the early moments of an investigation are, how easily time can turn questions into permanence. That awareness doesn't breed panic, it breeds attentiveness, a quieter, more grounded vigilance rooted in experience rather than fear. In private conversations, people admit to moments of unexpected relief that arrive late, long after they thought resolution had done all the work it could. A neighbor realizes she no longer tenses when a car slows near her driveway at night. A shop owner notices the way his shoulders drop when the anniversary passes, without the familiar nod of unease. These changes are subtle, almost imperceptible, but they accumulate, evidence that something internal has shifted. The case didn't just end a mystery, it loosened a grip the past had maintained for far too long. That release doesn't come with ceremony, it arrives quietly, in the absence of dread, in the normalization of nights that no longer feel charged with unanswered questions. For the family, The passage of time since the resolution allows for moments of unexpected lightness, laughter that doesn't immediately feel disloyal, memories that surface without pain overwhelming them. They begin to speak more freely about her life, about ordinary moments that had been overshadowed by the way it ended, reclaiming those stories from the gravity of the crime. Friends join in, sharing anecdotes that had been held back out of caution, unsure of how they would land in the long years of uncertainty. These exchanges feel like a rebalancing, a way of restoring dimension to someone who had been flattened by tragedy into a single defining event. The case gave them answers, but time gives them permission to live with those answers without being consumed by them. In professional circles, the Illinois case influences policy in incremental ways, changes that don't make headlines but shape outcomes nonetheless. Evidence retention protocols are revisited, interview practices refined, cold case units given clear mandates, and resources justified by the proof that persistence can matter. None of these shifts are dramatic, but together they represent an institutional memory forming around a hard-earned lesson. The case becomes part of training not as a cautionary tale of failure, but as an example of endurance, of how investigations can span generations without losing their moral center. It reinforces the idea that unresolved cases are not relics, they are responsibilities, and that treating them as such requires patience measured in years rather than weeks. The confession itself is studied less for its content and more for its timing, a focal point in discussions about why people speak when they do. Psychologists point to life transitions, declining health, the erosion of social roles that once reinforced silence. Philosophers talk about conscience as a force that doesn't obey clocks, emerging unpredictably, demanding recognition when it can no longer be ignored. None of these frameworks fully explain what happened, but together they outline the complexity of human behavior in a way that resists simplification. The Illinois case becomes an example of that resistance, a reminder that behind every delayed truth is a convergence of internal and external pressures that rarely align neatly. As years add distance, the emotional charge of the road itself shifts again, less heavy, more contemplative. It becomes a place where people think rather than feel, where the mind traces connections instead of the body reacting with tension. Some stop there deliberately, not out of morbid curiosity, but to mark a personal boundary between past and present, a way of acknowledging what happened without letting it dominate their inner landscape. There's a sense of respect in that pause, a recognition that memory doesn't require constant activation to remain meaningful. Sometimes it's enough to know, to carry the awareness quietly, letting it inform choices without dictating them. The story reaches audiences far beyond the town through podcasts, books, and long-form articles that frame it as part of a broader movement toward revisiting the unresolved. Each retelling introduces subtle shifts in emphasis, some focusing on the investigative process, others on the emotional aftermath, and while not every version captures the nuance, the sheer volume of attention ensures that the core truth endures. The family engages selectively, careful to correct inaccuracies when they appear, protective of the details that matter most to them. They understand that once a story enters the public sphere, control becomes limited, but they also recognize the power of speaking when it counts, shaping the narrative just enough to keep it grounded in humanity rather than spectacle. Within the town, there's a growing awareness of how stories evolve over time, how memory is shaped not just by events, but by the ways those events are retold. Older residents notice differences in how younger people describe the case, the emphasis shifting from fear to perseverance, from mystery to accountability. This evolution feels appropriate, a sign that the community is integrating the experience rather than being defined by it. The case becomes a chapter rather than the entire book, significant but not all-consuming, its lessons absorbed into a broader understanding of resilience and responsibility. The accused remains absent, physically and symbolically, and that absence becomes part of the resolution. There's no ongoing spectacle, no recurring reminders beyond the official record, and that restraint allows healing to continue without interruption. The focus stays where it belongs, on the impact rather than the individual, on the way silence affected many lives rather than the person who maintained it. This shift reflects a collective choice, conscious or not, to prioritize restoration over fixation, to let the story serve as context rather than distraction. As the case continues to recede into history, it leaves behind a changed landscape, not in visible markers, but in attitudes and assumptions. The town understands now that closure is not a moment but a process, that answers are not endpoints but milestones along a longer path of adjustment. That understanding fosters patience, both with institutions and with one another, a recognition that progress can be uneven without being meaningless. The Illinois cold case becomes a quiet benchmark, a reminder that even when justice arrives late, it still reshapes the present in tangible ways. In moments of reflection, when the layers of time feel especially thin, the case stands as proof that endurance matters, that attention sustained across decades can still yield truth. It underscores the idea that the past is not static, that it can be revisited and reinterpreted without being distorted, if approached with care. The shock that once defined the story has faded, replaced by a deeper, steadier resonance, one that doesn't demand reaction, but invites contemplation. And in that contemplative space, the community finds something close to equilibrium, a balance between remembering and moving forward, carrying the weight of what was learned without being crushed by it, and allowing the story of 1979 to exist not as an open wound, but as a source of hard-earned understanding that continues to shape the present long after the headlines have disappeared. The files never say it out loud, but by the 9th year of the investigation, the case is no longer just unsolved. It is slowly becoming invisible, buried under newer crimes, newer headlines, newer bodies, while this one sits in a cardboard box marked with a fading date and a name no one wants to mispronounce anymore, and yet the silence around it grows heavier, not lighter, as if time itself is pressing down. Because every unanswered question multiplies, every lost lead becomes a shadow that can no longer be chased, and the detectives who once knew every inch of the scene now struggle to remember why a certain detail once made their stomachs tighten. The town still remembers, though. Not loudly. Not in public meetings or candlelight vigils anymore. It lives in half-finished sentences, in the way people pause when they pass the old intersection, in the way parents lock doors a little faster at night even decades later, unable to explain to their children why. The cold case is no longer front-page news, but it has soaked into the place, into the rhythm of daily life, and every so often it resurfaces, triggered by something small, a stranger's face, a slammed door, the sound of tires on gravel, and suddenly 1979 feels close enough to touch. Inside the evidence room, the physical remnants of that night sit unchanged, sealed in plastic, labeled in careful handwriting that belonged to officers who have since retired or died, and the objects themselves feel almost accusatory now, because they are ordinary, painfully so, a jacket with a torn seam, a set of keys, a watch stopped at an unremarkable hour, items that should mean nothing and yet refuse to mean nothing, because they were there, because they absorbed something that can never be extracted. Modern investigators, called in years later to review the cold case, handle these items with gloves and quiet respect, but also with frustration, because technology has raced forward while the evidence has stayed frozen, and every new test feels like a question asked too late. DNA is partial. Fibers are contaminated. Witness statements contradict each other in ways that no longer feel malicious, just human, distorted by memory, fear, and the desire to survive in a town that wanted the nightmare to end. There is one witness, though, who keeps returning in the margins of the reports, a name circled, underlined, then crossed out, then circled again by different hands over different decades, a person who was never charged, never cleared, never fully believed or disbelieved, just suspended in that uncomfortable space where suspicion lives without proof. In the early years, investigators thought this witness knew more than they said. Later, they wondered if the witness knew nothing at all and had simply become a convenient container for everyone else's doubt. Interviews were conducted again and again, each time the questions slightly different, each time the answers slightly more guarded, until eventually the witness stopped agreeing to speak, citing health, fatigue, fear, or all three. The cold case notes describe this refusal in neutral language, but between the lines there is irritation, Even desperation, because when a case goes cold, it is often not because of what is hidden, but because of what will no longer talk. By the time the case is officially labeled a cold case, the original crime scene is unrecognizable. Buildings have been renovated, demolished, repainted. Streets have been widened. Trees that were saplings are now tall enough to block the view, and whatever secrets the ground once held have long since been disturbed by construction crews who had no idea what they were digging through. Detectives walk the area anyway, comparing old photographs to the present, trying to align memory with reality, and failing. The past does not fit neatly onto the present. It never does. And yet, in these walks, something unsettling happens. Neighbors still notice. Someone always watches from behind a curtain or a parked car, curious, wary, wondering if this renewed interest means something is about to break open, or if it is just another brief flare before the darkness settles again. The media returns in cycles. An anniversary. A tip line reactivated. A journalist with a slow voice and a serious expression promising new revelations that never quite materialize. Headlines use the same language every time. Cold case, mystery, unanswered questions, words that sound dramatic but feel hollow to those who have lived with them for decades. Families give interviews they have given before, repeating the same details because those details are all they have left. They speak carefully, aware that one wrong sentence can ignite rumors that will follow them for years. Their grief has aged, hardened into something quieter but no less heavy, and every time the case resurfaces, they are forced to reopen wounds that never fully closed. The promise of justice has become abstract, something they believe in more out of stubbornness than hope. Then there are the tips. They never stop completely. They slow, thin out, become stranger. Anonymous letters written in shaky handwriting. Phone calls that hang up before saying anything useful. Dreams recounted as memories. Confessions that collapse under basic scrutiny. Each one is logged, checked, and quietly dismissed, and with every dismissal the case sinks deeper into that gray space where possibility exists without momentum. Detectives assigned to the cold case unit learn quickly to manage their expectations. They know breakthroughs are rare, and when they come, they are often accidental, triggered by something unrelated, a new arrest, a database update, a casual remark made in a different investigation. Until then, the case waits. What makes this particular cold case unbearable is not just the absence of answers, but the sense that the truth passed close enough to be seen and then slipped away. Several times, investigators came within inches of something solid, a timeline that almost made sense, a suspect who almost cracked, a forensic result that almost pointed in one direction, and every time, the thread snapped. The reports use cautious language, but the emotional residue is unmistakable. Frustration, regret, the quiet fear that the person responsible lived a full life, unbothered, while the town carried the weight of their actions without ever knowing their name. As the years stack up, the case becomes a reference point for other investigations. Detectives mention it in passing, as a warning, as motivation, as an example of what happens when timing, luck, and truth fail to align. Younger officers study it in training, reading about decisions made under pressure, evidence handled with the standards of the time, and they wonder what they would have done differently, even as they know that hindsight is a luxury the original investigators never had. The cold case is no longer just a crime. It is a lesson, a ghost story told within the department, a reminder that not every narrative reaches a clean ending. And still, at night, the town remembers. The silence deepens. Streetlights hum. Windows glow softly. Somewhere, someone lies awake, replaying a night from decades ago, wondering if they missed something, said something wrong, trusted the wrong person, and whether that small moment of uncertainty mattered more than they ever knew. The cold case remains unresolved, suspended between past and present, refusing to fade, refusing to resolve, a wound that time did not heal but merely covered, waiting, always waiting, for a single undeniable truth to finally break through the noise and end the silence. By the 10th phase of the story, The case no longer belongs to any single detective, any single family, or even any single decade. It has become institutional memory, a presence that lingers in hallways and meeting rooms, surfacing whenever someone asks why a door was never opened, why a name was never followed harder, why a moment slipped by without consequence. The cold case exists now as a kind of quiet pressure, felt more than discussed, because everyone involved understands that what remains unsolved does not simply disappear. It accumulates, settling into the foundation of the department and the town alike. New investigators inherit the files the way one inherits an old house, aware that beneath fresh paint and updated systems, something unstable may still be buried underneath. Technology arrives like a promise whispered too late. Databases expand. Algorithms cross-reference. Old fingerprints are scanned again. Old samples reprocessed with tools the original investigators could not have imagined, and for a brief moment, optimism flickers, cautious, but undeniable. Meetings are held behind closed doors. Emails circulate with subject lines that hint at progress without daring to claim it. But the results come back incomplete, inconclusive, frustratingly close to meaningful, without ever crossing that line. A partial match here. A statistical probability there. Enough to reopen discussions, not enough to reopen courtrooms. The cold case resists resolution, adapting to modern scrutiny, the way it once evaded older methods. What complicates everything is the passage of human time. Witnesses age out of memory. Some die. Others move away, taking their versions of events with them, versions that may have been flawed or incomplete, but were still pieces of a larger picture that can no longer be assembled. Investigators read transcripts of interviews conducted decades earlier and find themselves analyzing tone, pauses, word choices, trying to extract meaning from static text, aware that body language, hesitation, and fear were never fully captured. The cold case becomes a puzzle, missing not just pieces, but the edges that once defined its shape. Families feel this stage differently. For them, hope has become dangerous. Each new development threatens to reopen grief they have learned to manage only by keeping it contained. Some family members disengage entirely, unable to endure another cycle of anticipation and disappointment. Others lean in, attending briefings, answering the same questions again, driven by a belief that persistence itself has value, that silence must eventually break if pressed hard enough. Their lives have moved forward in visible ways, marriages, children, funerals, but the case remains frozen, untouched by milestones, immune to closure. Rumors begin to change form. In earlier years, they were sharp, accusatory, pointed at specific individuals. Now they are abstract, almost philosophical. People speculate about systems rather than suspects, about failures rather than villains. Was it jurisdictional confusion? Ego? Fear of public backlash? The idea that the truth may have been lost not to malice but to hesitation is unsettling in a different way because it offers no single figure to blame, no clear target for anger. The cold case becomes a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable questions about how justice actually functions when conditions are imperfect. Inside the department, the case is occasionally used to test resolve. Assignments are given to see who will dig and who will skim, who treats the file as a burden and who treats it as unfinished business. Some investigators become quietly obsessed, staying late, remapping timelines, rereading statements, convinced that something obvious has been overlooked. Others learn to pace themselves, understanding that obsession without progress can hollow a person out. The cold case demands emotional discipline as much as intellectual effort, and not everyone survives that balance. Every so often, something almost happens. A suspect from another state triggers a review. A name surfaces in a different investigation. A confession is hinted at, then withdrawn, then explained away as misunderstanding or manipulation. Each near breakthrough leaves behind a residue of tension, a sense that the truth is circling but refusing to land. Detectives learn to temper their reactions, but the internal spike of adrenaline never fully disappears. The case trains them to expect disappointment while still preparing for impact. Public interest rises and falls with the rhythm of media attention. A documentary episode. a long-form article, a podcast that frames the case as a haunting narrative rather than an ongoing investigation. Each retelling adds layers, interpretations, emphasis, sometimes clarifying, sometimes distorting. Facts blur at the edges. Speculation hardens into belief for listeners who were never there. Investigators watch this with mixed feelings, knowing that attention can generate tips, but also knowing it can contaminate memory, rewriting the past in ways that are impossible to correct. What remains constant is the absence at the center of it all. The unanswered question. The moment that never received its explanation. The person who never faced accountability. The cold case continues to exert gravity, pulling thoughts, resources, and emotions toward itself, even as everyone involved insists they have learned to live with uncertainty. But uncertainty, when left unresolved, does not stay neutral. It erodes. It reshapes priorities. It teaches caution where there should have been confidence. As this phase draws on, the case sits at an uneasy intersection of possibility and resignation. It is no longer young enough to feel urgent, not old enough to be considered historical. It occupies a liminal space, where effort continues not because success is expected, but because stopping would feel like surrender. The cold case endures, patient, unyielding, its silence louder now than it has ever been, daring someone, anyone, to finally say something that changes everything. By the 11th and final movement, the case has outlived almost everyone who first touched it, and what remains is not resolution but gravity, a weight that bends every conversation around it, because unresolved truth does not fade. It settles, it waits, it insists. The cold case now lives in archives and after-hours offices, in password-protected folders and handwritten notes scanned into systems that will be replaced again, and each migration carries the same risk, that something vital will be lost not through negligence, but through translation, through the quiet friction of time. Investigators speak about it in the present tense even as they acknowledge the past, because to speak of it otherwise would be to concede defeat, and concession feels too much like erasure. The final reviews are careful, almost reverent. Timelines are laid out one last time, every minute accounted for as best as memory allows, every gap circled in red as if attention alone might force an answer to emerge. The contradictions remain. The missing hours refuse to explain themselves. The suspect list narrows and widens simultaneously, shaped less by evidence than by probability, by what seems plausible after decades of distance. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows the truth may already be gone, carried to a grave, sealed behind a conscience that never broke, or diluted across so many retellings that it can no longer be distinguished from noise. Families are informed of the status in language that is precise and cautious, words chosen to avoid cruelty, to avoid promises that cannot be kept. They listen with practiced stillness, nodding at familiar phrases, absorbing the implication beneath them. For some, this meeting is a formality, an acknowledgement that the search has reached a point where effort continues without expectation. For others, it is unbearable, a final reminder that justice is not guaranteed, that persistence does not always equal outcome. Their grief does not escalate. It hardens, becoming something dense and permanent, a companion they never asked for and cannot set down. The town carries on, outwardly unchanged. New families move in, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Children grow up without knowing why certain streets still feel heavy, why certain names provoke silence in older conversations. The place has learned to function around the absence, to incorporate it into daily life the way one incorporates a scar, no longer painful, never forgotten. And yet, on certain nights, when the air is still and sound travels farther than it should, the memory resurfaces uninvited, as if the past is checking to see if it has finally been acknowledged. Inside the department, the case is closed only in the administrative sense. It remains open in every other way. It is referenced when training new officers, not as a failure, but as a reality, a reminder that certainty is fragile and that timing can be as decisive as evidence. Veterans speak of it with a tone that blends frustration and respect, because the case resisted them, challenged them, forced them to confront the limits of their craft. It taught them that justice is an aspiration, not a constant, and that some questions survive the people who ask them. There is no final revelation. No confession breaks the silence. No evidence surfaces at the last moment to reorder the narrative and make sense of the chaos. What remains instead is an unresolved echo, a story without a clean ending, a cold case that refuses to be simplified into lessons or closure. Its power lies precisely there, in the unanswered, in the tension between what is known and what will never be proven. And so the story ends where it began, not with certainty, but with unease. A night that still has no explanation. A truth that remains just out of reach. A community shaped by a question it learned to live with, but never to silence. The cold case endures, not solved, not forgotten, suspended in the space between memory and mystery, reminding anyone who listens closely that some stories do not conclude. They linger, waiting, long after the lights go out and the voices fall quiet. By the 11th and final movement, the case has outlived almost everyone who first touched it, and what remains is not resolution but gravity, a weight that bends every conversation around it, because unresolved truth does not fade. It settles, it waits, it insists. The cold case now exists as a permanent presence inside the system, preserved in archived files and digitized records, passed from one generation of investigators to the next like an unanswered question no one dares to discard. It is spoken about in lowered voices, with a kind of professional respect, because everyone understands that this is not just a failure to solve a crime, but a reminder of how fragile certainty really is. The last formal review is thorough, almost ritualistic. Timelines are rebuilt minute by minute, statements reread with fresh eyes that still cannot escape old limitations, evidence examined one final time under lights that promise clarity but deliver only confirmation of what has long been suspected. Too much time has passed. Too many moments slipped away unnoticed. The contradictions remain where they always were, stubborn and unmoved, and the gaps, the missing hours, the unanswered phone calls, the unexplained movements, refuse to surrender their meaning. No one says it aloud, but the understanding settles in the room. The truth may have left with someone who never spoke, or it may never have existed in a single, clean form to begin with. Families are informed carefully, the language measured, precise, stripped of drama. There are no bold claims, no timelines for justice, only an honest acknowledgement of where things stand. Some listen in silence, already resigned, having grieved the loss of answers years ago. Others feel the weight of finality crash down in that moment, the realization that the door they kept cracked open for decades is now closing, not slammed shut, but gently, firmly, with no promise of reopening. Their pain does not erupt. It settles deeper, becoming something they carry quietly, permanently. The town continues its routines, largely unaware that a chapter has effectively ended. New residents arrive with no knowledge of what once happened there. Old landmarks lose their meaning to time. But beneath the surface, the memory still exists, embedded in stories that are no longer told, in pauses that linger too long, in the way certain questions are never asked. The cold case has shaped the place in subtle ways, teaching caution, teaching distance, teaching an unspoken understanding that not everything broken gets repaired. Within the department, the case is closed only on paper. In practice, it remains open in spirit, referenced in training rooms, cited in quiet conversations, used as a reminder of how quickly opportunity can vanish. Veteran investigators speak of it without bitterness, but with humility, because it forced them to confront the limits of evidence, memory, and time. It taught them that justice is not guaranteed, that effort does not always lead to outcome, and that some truths resist exposure no matter how intensely they are pursued. There is no last-minute confession, no dramatic discovery, no reversal that redeems the years of uncertainty. Instead, there is silence, deep, unresolved, and enduring. The cold case remains what it has always been, a story without an ending, a wound without closure, a question that echoes long after the investigation has stopped moving. And that is where it rests. Not solved, not forgotten. Suspended between what is known and what will never be proven. A cold case that continues to exist not because it has answers, but because it refuses to disappear, lingering in memory, in history, and in the quiet understanding that some mysteries do not conclude. They remain, waiting, long after the search itself has gone still. By the 12th movement, the case has crossed a line few investigations ever reach. It has become something that exists beyond procedure, beyond active pursuit, living instead as a quiet anomaly in the record, a reminder that even the most determined search can arrive at a place where motion no longer produces progress. The cold case is still there, still cataloged, still technically open to reconsideration, but it now carries a different kind of stillness, one that feels deliberate rather than defeated, as if the system itself has accepted that some truths resist extraction no matter how carefully they are handled. What remains is maintenance rather than momentum. Files are preserved. Evidence is checked for integrity, not expectation. Digital backups are verified, not because a breakthrough is anticipated, but because forgetting would feel like a second loss. The case becomes part of a larger promise, not that it will be solved, but that it will not be erased. Investigators who encounter it for the first time do so without urgency, reading through decades of effort with a sober understanding that they are entering the story near its end, not its beginning. They are not looking for the answer anymore. They are learning how unanswered questions endure. The language around the case shifts subtly. Words like lead and suspect are used less often. In their place come terms like context, environment, limitations. The focus turns outward, examining how the investigation unfolded rather than what it might still uncover. Decisions made long ago are reevaluated, not to assign blame, but to understand how timing, culture, and pressure shaped outcomes. The cold case becomes a study, not just of a crime, but of an era, a snapshot of how justice once moved and where it slowed. For the families, this stage brings an unfamiliar quiet. The phone no longer rings with updates, real or imagined. Anniversaries pass with less public attention. The world appears to move on, and with it comes a complicated relief. The absence of anticipation means the absence of fresh disappointment. Grief settles into routine. Memory becomes private. They speak of the case less often, not because it matters less, but because carrying it loudly has become too heavy. Their connection to the truth no longer depends on outcomes. It exists in remembrance alone.